Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always pleased to rise in this House to speak on behalf of my constituents, and today we're debating C-35, an act respecting early learning and childcare. Now, I spoke on this bill at second reading before it went to committee, and reviewing my comments from my previous speech, I don't see many improvements that would address the very important concerns I have with this legislation. Now, from the outset, I want to affirm that Conservatives support making childcare more affordable for families. That is why back in 2006, our Conservative government created the universal childcare benefit that put money directly in families' pockets to spend on their priorities. Now, at the time, the Liberals claimed that families would just spend this on beer and popcorn, but they have since come around to our position with their improved Canada Child Benefit, which combined a number of already existing childcare benefits, including the Conservative Universal Childcare Benefit, under one program. Now the Liberals have moved forward with their new Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Initiative. In Budget 2021, this was projected to cost $25 billion at least over 5 years. Now, due to record high inflation and high demand for limited affordable childcare spaces and limited professional childcare workers, this number has undoubtedly become far larger. Now, I would remind this House that this program is being funded entirely by borrowed money, and the cost of these Liberal deficits and higher interest rates means that for every $1 billion borrowed, they will pay an additional $45 million in interest every year. Now, I'm very excited to see the new Oppenheimer movie coming out, and thinking about that movie got me thinking about the brilliant Albert Einstein. And Einstein is reported to have said that the eighth wonder of the world is compound interest, and those who understand it will receive it, and those who don't understand it will pay it. Well, I don't think this Liberal government understands it, because compound interest is truly a powerful force. And as these Liberals borrow billions more each year to fund their programs, that interest compounds. And at current interest rates of 4.5% for Canada government bonds, the interest costs for a plan that costs $1 billion a year will exceed and rise exponentially as this government borrows year after year. These deficits are radically increasing the interest costs that Canadian taxpayers will have to pay. Now, eventually this debt will have to be repaid, and it's Canadians and the economy that will suffer because the government will either have to borrow more or tax Canadians more to pay for it. Now, we've always given the Liberals a hard time. We've called them the tax and spend Liberals, but today we have something that's far, far worse than a tax and spend Liberal. It's called a borrow and spend Liberal. Now, at least with a tax and spend Liberal, they would go out and they would raise taxes and they would try to gather money in order to pay for their programs. Well, with a borrow and spend Liberal, they conjure this money out of thin air. They create new money in the system, and this creates inflation in two ways. Because by competing for capital in the economy, they raise the cost of everything from your mortgages, from business lines of credit, which thus raises the costs of owning a home, the costs of running a business, and many other things. And the second way that it creates inflation is when they spend that money. And when government spends that money that they've borrowed, they're competing with consumers and businesses for goods and services, and this raises the cost of everything. Now, the Liberal childcare plan is not only proving to be an expensive failure, it is extraordinarily inflationary. Now, I have been spending the last 2 years since this government brought forward this program consulting with families and childcare operators, and very few of them have anything good to say about these programs. Now, while some families have benefited from lower childcare costs, there are at least tens of thousands of Canadian children who are stuck on waiting lists. Some of them have been stuck on these waiting lists for years, and their children will be in kindergarten before a spot ever opens up, if ever. So they will not benefit from this program. Now, the guiding principles under the Section 7 of funding in this bill says that this program must be accessible, affordable, and inclusive. Now, the program as it stands, it's been implemented over the past couple of years. It's still in the process of being fully implemented. But looking at the outcome of what we've seen so far, the program as it stands is not accessible. There are at least 50% of families that haven't been able to access an affordable care space. It's not affordable because for those families that cannot access a space, they're still paying the full price, the unsubsidized price for childcare. And it's certainly not inclusive because there are families from all sorts of communities, because this is a universal childcare plan. It doesn't matter if you're a family that earns hundreds of thousands of dollars a year or a family that is below the poverty line. There's no consideration for lower income families and special dispensation for these families. So what we're seeing is that marginalized communities are being further marginalized by being excluded from programs. So on their own principles, this government is failing to achieve what they said their principles. They also said under Section 7, subsection B of this legislation that the bill must provide access that enables families of all incomes, including low incomes, to benefit. Now, before the implementation of the Liberal Early Learning and Childcare Plan, many families across Canada already benefited from subsidy programs that were provided by their municipalities and by their provincial governments. And these low-income families were paying far less for childcare than the top rate that most families, middle-income families and upper-income families, were paying. So these families were already benefiting from government subsidies in some form or the other. But because this government has implemented a system that is universal, it doesn't take into account means testing income, you have a flood of people from middle and upper income families who are taking spots in the system, and these low income families that could get subsidized spots in the system are no longer benefiting from these spots. And so on another principle of this legislation, the government's already existing childcare plan is failing. I would also say that the statistics show that the demographics of people who are already accessing childcare in this country before the implementation of this Liberal plan were primarily middle and upper income families. And for those middle and upper income families who already had a childcare space, these are the families that have been the primary beneficiaries because they never had to wait on a waiting list because they already had a childcare space. So when the government took their, say, $1,500 a month that they're paying and brought it down to $500 a month, well, they're putting $1,000 a month in the pocket of primarily middle and upper income families. And this fails on the standard and principle of creating equity and creating fairness because we know that inflation impacts the lowest income families the most. And because lowest income families spend proportionally more of their income on things like shelter and housing, transportation, food, and other things. And so when these families don't get access to childcare, they're continuing to spend a lot of money. But when higher income families get access to these government subsidies, which they are currently, they get extra money in their pocket, and they're going to spend it on things that aren't necessarily shelter or necessities because they're higher income. It's a lower proportion. So they're spending these things on, maybe more restaurants or a new vehicle or maybe a bigger house. And we're seeing that these are areas where inflation is really rising in this country. And this is another reason that demonstrates the inflationary power of this government's legislation. And the people that are being hurt the most are the lower income families because the prices of things are being pushed further and further beyond their reach. Also speaking to childcare operators, I said, what is the biggest problem that you're facing? And they said labor is the biggest problem. They said to me that currently in Ontario, the most you can pay a childcare operator is $25 an hour. That's annualized at about $48,000 a year. There was a woman working at a daycare center that has been working there for 30 years, and she's getting paid $25 an hour. She is making less after inflation today than she was making when she started 30 years ago. Wow. And for a high school graduate or a university graduate coming straight out of school, an entry-level job in the federal government will pay them around $48,000 a year. So a 30-year professional childcare operator, under this Liberal plan, which has raised wages, has said they're going to raise wages somewhat, are still making less than an entry-level worker for the federal government. And this competition for labor, they're losing people left, right, and center. They can't retain people. And because of the restrictions and the regulations that this government has put in place under this legislation, they can't compete for this labor. And their hands are tied. and they're losing staff, which is losing capacity, which is increasing wait lists, and this is an unfolding disaster that families are seeing across Canada. And finally, I will say that the childcare director told me the reason families can't get spots is because this government has capped the amount of spots that they'll fund. These families can't get spots because this government is choosing not to fund them. This government is responsible for the wait lists that we're seeing in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.